right, welcome everybody. Welcome to the midsummer meeting of Mad City Bexters. Glad that you're all here. We are doing something a little different today. We've got a thematic event. We're going to talk about measurement and evaluation of behavior change. For those of you who don't know yet, I'm Ingo Bench from the Energy Center, Wisconsin. I'll start us off. We've got 4 of us who will be presenting. And I'm excited about this topic, and I'm excited to get you all involved in some discussion after we have some presentations. We're also recording this event so we can share it with those members of Bexters who are out traveling. We have a lot of the academics not in town, and that we can share it more broadly with the world. So that's why we have a camera in the back. All right, so just to get us started, I wanted to tee us off with a few quick remarks. First, on a July day, what better thing to think of than snow, right? So in thinking about behavior change, you can think of behavior change efforts and programs as being a little bit like a snowball fight. You spend a lot of time getting yourself set up for it. You might even build a snow fort like my kids do and spend days getting snowballs all made and stored away in different caches. And then you get the snowball fight, and you're furiously lobbing it over on the other side. And in the snowball fight, then you go home and you had fun and you go home. But in behavior change, you kind of need to know what happened during the snowball fight when you throw it over in the other fort. Are you actually reaching the other people in the snowball fight? Are you hitting anybody? In a behavior program, are you reaching folks? Are you actually inducing behavior change? What is happening? What are your end results? And that's a tough thing to know, but it's a really important thing to know if you're running programs, because otherwise you can't adjust to what is working and what isn't working. And depending on where you do your behavior change efforts, you probably answer to folks who want to know, what have you accomplished? And in different arenas, the standards of measurement are different. So we'll talk mostly about energy-related behavior change today, but the concepts apply broadly. And we'll focus mostly on measuring behavior, although there's that additional step on measuring the energy impact, or if you're in sustainability, the sustainability impact. So those are the topics we hope to cover today. Our speakers, we will start with Terry Lutz from Tetra Tech. Terry is a senior utilities manager at Tetra Tech with over 20 years of combined utility and evaluation experience. Previously, she worked for a utility and was responsible for energy efficiency and the demand response portfolio that included implementation, evaluation, and compliance reporting in Pennsylvania and Maryland. And for Tetra Tech, she manages a full spectrum of evaluation projects, including the evaluation of behavior-based programs. She says she's relatively new to behavioral science and evaluation space, but she's a welcome addition. Then we'll have Sean Bodman share some remarks. Sean is a senior consultant at DNV-GL and has a PhD in psychology. He works on both process and impact evaluations, and his work on behavior-based programs includes multiple evaluations on behavior and energy impacts of the O-Power home energy reports, on time of use rates, and on the Powerhouse television show. And then we've got Letitia Younger-Canlon from Navigant Consultant. She's a senior consultant there, and is also a PhD candidate in political science at UW-Milwaukee. She's an expert in survey construction and survey design, and her work in the behavior-based programs includes studies on focusing on how technology influences behavior and prompts action in statewide and single jurisdiction settings. And I'll also introduce myself. I'm a principal researcher here at the Energy Center of Wisconsin. Tomorrow is my 16th anniversary of being here. Previously, I worked as a program evaluator for the Wisconsin legislature, and most of my work is in studying the human side of the energy equation, whether that's in behavioral research, market research, or program evaluation. And I also have 2 teenage or near teenage sons at home, so that gives me plenty of opportunity to try to figure out human behavior. So our plan today, I presented it as a presentation logic model, geeky as that is. Terry will have some remarks on program planning considerations, setting yourselves up for measurement and knowing what's going on if you're doing a behavior program. Then Sean will share some insights about measurement challenges and the toolbox that people trying to do measurement on behavior have available to them and are currently using. Letitia will share some emerging approaches to measuring behavior, kind of looking at the future and some things to come. And then we'll do a group exercise that I'll facilitate where we all get to be evaluators of a program and try to figure out how to crack that nut. And then we'll have some time for discussion and networking. We only have a morning. We could spend all day talking about how to measure behavior change, so we are only going to scratch the surface, but hopefully this will be interesting and enlightening to you, get you thinking, and we'd be happy to continue the dialogue in future Baxters or other arenas. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Terry on program planning considerations in the behavior change arena.
There we go. All right, evaluation planning, sooner is better than later. And as Ingo mentioned, I am just a couple years into the evaluation space. Most of my experience in the energy field has been on the utility side, and mostly in distribution and transmission engineering and planning on that side, and then just moving into the efficiency field in the last few years at the utility. So my perspective is rather limited to that particular arena, but I think what I've noticed from being able to kind of bring those two experiences together is now that I've been in the evaluation space, there seems to be a real gap in thinking about how you do the evaluation when you're first starting off in your program design. Because at the utility, the utility I worked with decided we're going to do everything in-house. We're going to do all our in-house planning and development, all our implementation, all our measurement, all our reporting, et cetera, everything in-house. So I had that full spectrum of what that takes. And there's so much going on when you're doing all that planning and all that thinking about what to include in your portfolios, how you're going to meet all the different targets you might have set across your two different states, especially because they differ. They're not going to be the same. So different levels of impact value, or I'm sorry, different levels of energy savings, different levels of demand response, different levels of target markets that you need to address within your portfolio to make sure it's an equitable offering across the different sectors within your different states or regions. You have all this stuff going on. You're not really thinking about how you're going to evaluate it on the back end. Sure, you know how you're going to measure and report it because that's all part of your developing your portfolio and establishing your, how you're going to get to your targets. But you really don't think about evaluating. It's just like the furthest thing from your mind. Then it gets time for implementation, and again, you're not thinking about that. You're just trying to get stuff out in the field so that you can start getting savings in the door and report. And really, it wasn't until probably into our second year that we really started thinking about, okay, now we've got to really start proving that we're getting these savings. How are we going to do that? And we were behind the ball. We didn't have kind of that infrastructure set up early on to collect all the right data and information to answer all the questions. We could answer a lot of the basic questions, but there was a lot that we couldn't answer. So really just the message is, as you're working with clients or if you're an implementer starting up new programs, it's just so critical to think about, what are those things that you're trying to achieve as a part of your program, and how are you going to measure those changes that you're trying to enact. So some of the things, of course, and I know there's a lot of experienced folks here, so please, if there's things in particular that you're very passionate about that aren't part of this slide or discussion, feel free to speak up. But some of the things, of course, that are kind of just the basic questions, the basic building blocks of evaluation is, what are you trying to achieve? What are the goals? And is it on the impact side? Because those are usually more clear-cut and dry. But then there's also all the things that you're trying to achieve to get to those savings, and how do you set up those measurements? And there's different designs that are really critical, even especially on the behavioral side, on how it's set up. Or is it an opt-in program or an opt-out program? Those really have a big impact on how you can design, even on the impact side, how you're going to set up that, that evaluation experiment or that evaluation study. And then, so based on those program designs, the data that you have available, and the things that you're trying to achieve, what are the methods that are possible? Which ones make the most sense? And there might be ones that are the gold standard that Sean will talk about more later, but if you don't have the data and information and intelligence to be able to set up those kind of designs, what are your alternatives, and how do you go about identifying what the best and most cost-effective way is to do those evaluations? So what data and information is needed are those those requirements reasonable? I know when we started thinking about evaluation and trying to set up the framework to be able to do a better job of that, the pushback we got from implementation was, that's way too much. We can't collect all that data. People are not going to want to provide that data. So it really is about finding that balance about what is reasonable to collect to support your evaluation effort without becoming a barrier to implementation and to participation. So that's one of the things we try to be sensitive now, even on the evaluation side. We don't want to set up barriers to participation, but we still want to be able to collect the information and data we need to be able to successfully measure it. And then, of course, how reliable is that data and information? So how do you get that incorporated into the whole implementation process then? So, you know, as I mentioned, it's having that discussion with your key stakeholders. In this case, it would be with your implementers, or with your clients, or with your evaluators, depending on which side of the fence you are on, to come up with what really makes the most sense. So you don't want an application that's 5 pages long. If you really only need 1 page of information, the other information might be great to have, but maybe there's alternative ways to get some of that information. We don't necessarily have to ask participants every question there is. And another big thing that really seems to, it just kind of astounds me. I mean, on our end, I can certainly appreciate it. But now that we're even further along, there still seems to be, when I work with folks on the evaluator side, that clear QA, that quality assurance and quality control around data collection. That does not seem to be always the first thought about what it is we're collecting and we're going to report on. And those are processes that get developed over time. So again, if those are things we can think of up front, because collecting that upfront baseline information really is just so critical for setting that stage later on. And we want to have confidence in that information that we've gathered early on so that we can do those comparisons in the longer term. That quality assurance and quality control is really so critical. So thinking more then on the behavioral side, so the intended program outcomes. Of course, there's behaviors that we all do right now and that our intended target audiences do right now. And there's things that their behaviors impact. So if it's on the energy side, you know, the things that we're doing every day has an impact on our energy usage as a baseline before any interventions come along. So we design a program, we throw it out there, we try to get the message out across the wall, and those snowball effects to our intended audiences to try and enact this change that we then hope will have this impact. But I think we all know that doesn't necessarily always happen that way. There's all these other influences that come along. And some of these influences can help support your message, but then other influences can detract from that message and push against it. So, and this speaks to kind of that whole evaluation planning, truly understanding where is your audience today, what are the behaviors they're doing, and what are those impacts, understanding what all those different influences can be along the way before and during when you get your message out. And then how do all those interact? How can you actually tease out the impacts or the effect that your program is having on those behaviors and actions and decisions that your audiences or your target market is making? Oh, I guess that's all. Do I have enough time for any? Are there any questions at all from anybody at this time? If not, I'll turn it over to Sean.
When you are measuring behaviors, when you're measuring the outcomes of these behavioral programs, there's several challenges that you're going to face when you're trying to establish what really happened with this program. One of the challenges itself are the behaviors that the programs are trying to influence. Many of these behaviors are leveraging social science concepts and motivational knowledge that we've learned through psychology and sociology, and they're not necessarily targeting specific behaviors. They're just trying to get people to reduce their energy use. And so since there are so many different behaviors that could be influenced by the particular program, by the motivational techniques that the behavioral-based programs are trying to leverage, the evaluators might have a wide range of space, a lot of different behaviors that they need to try to assess whether they were affected or not. Further complicating that is many of the behaviors that are targeted by these programs are what are often called habitual behaviors. They're little things that we do very often during the day that in many cases we may not even think about. And so trying to get at how much change has happened in those kind of behaviors can also be pretty difficult. Further muddying the waters is that direct observation is often not possible. You can't really go into people's homes and watch what they're doing. And even if you did, you'd get Hawthorne effect, and that's where people act differently when they know they're under observation. Right? So you really can't go and look and see what they were doing. And then finally, timing. Evaluators out there know that you often don't get to get involved until well after the program has been going on. And so often we're talking about, we're trying to measure things that happened 2 years ago or a year ago, right? That's a pretty long space of time, especially when you're talking about a wide variety of behaviors that are often habitual type behaviors. So the toolbox, the C action report put out by ACEEE goes into a lot of detail about different evaluation designs. They really advocate strongly for randomized control trials. A lot of their concern in that report is about internal validity and reducing the amount of potential bias that you're going to, self-selection bias in particular, that's going to occur. In a randomized controlled trial, you have a group of participants, potential participants that are generally matched, and you randomly assign a group to receive the treatment and a group to not receive the treatment. That takes any self-selection bias out of the equation. It also helps you, as Terry mentioned, there's a whole bunch of other exogenous factors that can affect the results, that can affect energy use, such as weather or social effects. When you can randomly assign people to a treatment or control group, that helps you really control for a lot of those exogenous factors as well. So the C action report really advocates for randomized control trials. Those are not really always possible or practical, and in particular, the program implementers have to really have to set that up from the beginning of the program. You can't come in 2 years after the program is running as an evaluator and say, oh, we're going to do a random control trial. So then the report goes into these variety of other methods that I'm not going to go into a bunch of detail on, but they're listed here, and if you want more information, you can go see that C action report. One of the things that the C action report says is a drawback to all these other methods is that there's a certain amount of bias, and you can never really tell how much bias is really existing in your measurements. With all these other methods, introduce the risk of bias influencing your results. So then when you get down to what you can actually do, what are the actual ways that you can measure the behaviors that your program is trying to influence? One of them is energy savings, surveys, and then home inspections are another method that I've seen in a few evaluations recently. So benefits of energy savings is usually the main goal of the program. So you're probably going to be, evaluators are probably going to be looking at energy savings anyways. Generally, energy savings are going to come from meter data, and so the reliability on those data is considered relatively high. And every so often you can get lucky and you can find patterns in the energy data that can give you a clue as to what behaviors were actually happening. An example of that would be if you see a lot of gas savings in the summer months and not really much in the winter months, that could be a marker that it's water heating that's going on there instead of space heating. Drawbacks on using energy savings to try to get at behaviors is it's usually math intensive. You usually got to have a stats person or an econometrics person to do much with those data. And even though you can sometimes get lucky with the patterns, usually you can't. Usually pulling specific behaviors out of those patterns is pretty difficult or impossible. Surveys, benefits of surveys, they're familiar. We all know about surveys. We've done, most of the evaluators out there have done a lot of surveys. They're relatively easy to complete, and you can target specific behaviors with them. Drawbacks are reliability on surveys is often doubtful, especially when you're talking about 2-year retrospective self-reports on habitual behaviors. And generally, you need really high ends to detect significant differences. So that will raise your survey costs and your survey, it'll raise your costs. And then they often have to be long. If you're trying to ask people about 80 different behaviors, that takes a long time. That's you get respondent burnout. Reliability of your later questions is probably going to be reduced even more when you're in that situation. And it raises the cost of doing the surveys as well. So drawback there. Home inspections, advantages of home inspections, since evaluators or trained experts are doing those inspections, again, they are high reliability type of measurements, but, and they can do a pretty good job at detecting equipment changes, so how many CFLs did people put in, did they reduce their water heater set point, did they install high efficiency appliances or air conditioners. But they're expensive, right? You've got to have field staff out there doing those. And you can't really get at habitual behaviors with home inspections. So you're really kind of limited to those equipment changes. So with that, I'll turn it over to Letitia, and she can tell you about the future.
Thank you. So Sean gave us a nice review of what's currently in practice at the moment. But where are things going? What's next for us? Well, one of the things that I want to talk to you guys about today is an area called passive measurement. It's grown pretty significantly out of the market research area. And basically what it is tracking participant behavior without their overt knowledge that they're being tracked. And I'm sure that you're wondering, how does this work? Well, I'll tell you. It primarily involves opt-in programs, obviously. Participants are often paid for their participation in a study, and the payment for their participation is sort of on a sliding scale. It ranges from less invasive types of studies where participants earn points so that they can cash in for magazine subscriptions or gift cards, to the more invasive long-term studies where participants actually receive serious compensation through checks or through larger denomination gift cards. And there's really sort of three tracks that I'm going to talk about that are the sort of the main streams of how this is being used to study behavior. And the first one is web-based tracking. You're probably most familiar with web-based tracking. An example I have here is a web portal from Tendril. You may or may not have heard of them, but they're actually the Nest's primary competition at this point. But basically, what happens here, like in many programs where customers are given access to a portal where they can review their energy use at home, every time that they click through the site, look at their energy usage, if they look at their competition with how they compare to their neighbors or their friends, all of that information is recorded. How long they sit on the page, what they do when they leave the website, all of that is recorded, and that information then is tied back to their billing data, and then also used to create more precise questions in surveys that would be conducted to sort of look at this as being an intervention point where information is being delivered, and then how behavior changed as a result of that afterward. Upping the ante is app-based tracking. Now here, it's the first track of the first version of how this would be used is very similar to how web portals would be used, where it's the same sort of thing, except it's more immersive. Everyone in this room, I'm sure, has a smartphone, and some of you may actually have an app from your utility. And in some cases, there are utilities that are providing energy usage data through that smartphone app, but they're also providing a way to connect to your community members, friends, family who are also using it so you can compare your data. They're also providing tips, energy efficiency information, maybe links to Energy Star, other types of information, and maybe sometimes challenges or activities that the person can engage in to save energy. And all of those are intervention points, and all of that information is tracked. And the nice thing about it is that you can carry your phone around your house. I mean, that's the idea is, well, it's presumed anyway, that this is more, it's real-time feedback that can have more opportunity to influence behavior. And then also, because of the data that's coming back from the use of the app, you can ask even more precise questions. The second track for using app-based tracking here is that it comes more from the market research field, where apps can be downloaded to the phone, and then in California, actually, there's a number of campaigns that are going on for different energy efficiency programs. Well, what you might not know is that most television and radio ads are encoded with a digital signature. So whenever that app and the individual holding the phone is near that digital signature, it picks it up as a record that you were exposed to that message. So that information comes back to whoever's looking at the data, and they know, okay, you were exposed to this radio ad about this home energy audit program on X number of occasions, and we can ask you about that and whether you opted into the program to participate, what you did, and so on and so forth. And with that program, because it's more sort of intensive, there's some ethical issues around it. People do, again, opt in, but they're often paid more for that, and it kind of gets around the issue of there being less tech savvy sort of participants. The same way that we used to worry about how cell phones would impact survey results. Well, with this particular type of tracking, you can provide less tech-savvy users with an in-home device that they can place near their television. You can plug it into your car to pick up the radio, and in some cases, you can wear a button that will track you when you walk around. So that's out there and possibly on the horizon. Well, what I think is really going to be the most innovative and useful approach is the in-home and building tracking. And this basically leverages the smart grid. And as the graphic here shows, with an advanced metering infrastructure in place and smart meters installed in a home or in a building, the utility, or whoever it is, can gather information on energy use within the home remotely. Now, if the user, the participant customer, if they have a home area network where there's a gateway into the home, not only do they have more control over their energy use, they know more about what's going on, they can control their lighting, because there's a number of companies that provide bulbs that you can control from your phone and so on and so forth. But this gets connected to your own mini-grid, so to speak. And you can control your smart appliances, you can control your programmable thermostat, and depending on the reach of the utility, you also have access to, they have access to the gas meter and water meter, things like that. And all of that information is there for the participant to use, multiple intervention points, but it all goes back to the utility as well. So all that can be used for remote audits. Now, on the commercial side, there's a few utilities that have actually looked at using this as a way to determine whether or not a building can do retrocommissioning in advance without having to even bother the customer, and sort of isolate which customers might be able to get retrocommissioning, and then send people out to sort of encourage them to do it using this information. It makes it a more interactive sort of situation, but there's and also it can improve the type of programs that are being developed and delivered. So there's a lot of opportunity here in a lot of different directions, and I'm very excited about it. So that's what I have. Inga?
So it's one thing to sit and hear presentations. It's another to actually work through the material and try to come up with answers yourselves. So what we thought we'd do now, before we throw it open to more far-ranging discussion on anything that you want to talk about a little bit more, is have you dig in and help design an evaluation, a measurement approach for one kind of behavior program. I happen to pick one that I'm very familiar with myself because it's easier to introduce and easier to try to facilitate a conversation about it, and that happens to be a technical training that the Energy Center has been putting on for a decade now. It's our Better Buildings, Better Business Conference, which is a residential builder-directed or a residential construction-directed conference that really accomplishes or does a couple of things. It's intended to motivate, but then also provide technical training and technical skills to the attendees to take back to their jobs to actually change their practices and build more energy efficient, more sustainable buildings. And we've long thought and wondered, does a technical training like this actually lead to behavior change, and is it measurable? And can it live up to the standards that people who would like to see results at rigorous standards, well, can live up to those kinds of standards? So we've experimented ourselves. At the end, I can share a little bit as to what we tried to do and what worked and what didn't, but I would love to hear this group kind of grapple with this. If you were putting on this kind of information-based event where you're showing people how to do something different on their jobs, and then they go and they do what they're going to do, how would you go about trying to measure that and get a sense of whether you've impacted people's on-the-job practices or not? So I'll throw it open and just kind of bring forth your ideas or discussion about the challenges or the opportunities in trying to measure this sort of thing. Okay, so you're suggesting self-reports after the fact, but you added the element of trying to measure persistence by asking over a series of time, are you doing anything different? Okay. What would you ask? Would it be an open question, like, are you doing anything different as a result of this, or would you have targeted questions? Right, so you want to address the self-response or desirable response bias issue. Okay, great. Sherry. Okay, so you're suggesting actually measuring the homes people build in some way. Your specific suggestion is the HERS rating, but somehow measuring the efficiency or sustainability of the homes that are constructed. What would you compare that to? So you see if there's a difference. So compare to standard practice and see whether the attendees are doing something different after the conference than standard practice. That's true. They might market that way. And in fact, that's part of the conference as well. They try to teach how to sell energy efficiency to the ultimate clients. Okay, so Seth, you're getting at being more rigorous and having a control group. And yeah, in concept, offering the conference that has no content and comparing two groups would accomplish that. I'll have to talk. Well, this conference isn't at the Dell, so. Okay, so you're exploring whether there are blueprints or documents that show how the buildings were built. So instead of looking at the buildings, you're looking at a paper comparison if that is viable. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Right, and that's an excellent point. You have this progression of changing behavior, and the behavior changes energy, and it's a two-step process. So yes, you can jump right to the end by doing some kind of building analysis, but like Sean pointed out in his presentation, you then don't know what got you there necessarily. Or you try to measure the behavior change, and you see what are people doing differently, but then there's that additional step of figuring out what impact did that have on the energy, and that depends on how well it was executed, where it was implemented, the bigger picture of the implementation of it. Okay, so how is it marketed? It's marketed to the target audience. So yes, there are invitations, there are announcements, and then it is a conference that, as somebody had pointed out, runs year after year after year. So you have repeat attendees who know about it, and they'll attend year after year, some of them. Okay, so you're talking about taking everybody that's marketed to, figure out,
to create a baseline.
And then if there are building plans, you could look at building plans and see if there's a difference. If there are not building plans, then. Okay, so it's getting this idea is becoming more rigorous and more comprehensive, more complicated too. But you're creating tighter bounds around who you're studying, dividing them into groups, and then doing multiple kinds of measurement to figure out what happened and comparing between groups. So you're introducing the complication that you've got practices, some of which depend on the ultimate property owner, either the choice they made in how the building was built or how they operate it, and some of them will be things that are completely in control of the builder, like whether they put in the insulation properly or not. So you're increasing the feasibility and the rigor of it by narrowing the scope of what you're measuring to a few or one specific practice that would be easy to defend, that a new implementation of it is something that would not have happened without the conference. Yeah. You're getting past the self-reporting by having peer reporting or supervisor reporting of are there changes in practice, but you'd need to figure out what are you asking them about. So you again need to identify what are the behaviors that you can specifically ask the supervisors about, which would need to come from the content of the conference. So let's take one or two more, and then I'll share what we actually did that worked and what we did that didn't work, or at least we think worked and we think didn't work. And then we can have more general discussion. And I'll also invite the presenters today to weigh in if they have any thoughts to share that haven't already been mentioned. So one or two more thoughts? Okay. Yeah, good idea. So get self-reports, but get before and after conference self-reports on practices and see if there's a difference. Okay, so you're talking about some kind of, almost like a green stamp, but it's self-reported, that the attendees would self-report by labeling. So I'll share one thing that we did and one thing that, well, two things that we did, one that we feel good about and one that we don't. So the big picture here that we were grappling with is that you have attendees at the conference who are exposed to work, but not all of them work on houses. You have builders, but you have program managers, you have regulators, code officials. So the first thing that we needed to do is limit our audience to the target audience, folks who work on buildings, who have the ability to build differently. So we did that. We limited our sample to folks who are either builders, remodelers, or subcontractors, insulation contractors, HVAC contractors, and the like. The next step is figure out whether there was a change in practice. So the way we went about that is actually kind of complicated, but we had we always do day of the event evaluations, so we had feedback from all of the attendees as to who they are, what they thought of the conference, and we have been asking, did you pick up any ideas that you intend to use? So we get a metric there for what that's worth. We also get informal feedback at the conference. But beyond that, we then looked at the detail, the content that was delivered through all of the sessions, at least the technical training-oriented sessions. We analyzed the content that was delivered to figure out what might people do differently after having heard what was delivered. We created a telephone follow-up survey. It's actually a little bit more of an interview, semi-structured, where we asked a number of very open-ended questions and also closed-ended questions. Do you remember the conference? What did you take away from it? But also, did you try anything any different as a result of stuff you heard at the conference? What was it? How did it work out for you? Are you still doing it? And we had a few targeted questions. Did you do this? Did you do this? Did you do this? Based on the content that was delivered. So we had one of our folks follow up with builders, do early morning telephone interviews, because that's the only time we could actually reach them on the phone, like 7 o'clock in the morning. I'll skip the bottom parts of this chart because that's a whole different analysis on whether people were driven to the programs or not. Anyway, having gotten the interview results, we then looked at the credibility of it. What is it that people probably meant if they said, oh, I changed my air sealing practices and here's what I did? Did that sound like it's comprehensive? Did that sound kind of weak? Based on how they described it, and we assessed likely energy effects to it. It's a small thing. The way they described it, it's a small thing on the house that they did it at, or it's a big thing, and we created ranges of, it seems we had technical residential building experts look at this. It seems like this is something that could save from here to here, and from then on we used ranges instead of saying we're assigning a savings amount of X. We also had asked questions about, did you do this on all of your buildings? Did this persist? How often do you do this? And which kinds of buildings do you do this? How many buildings did you build? So we multiplied all of that out in order to have a savings range estimate at the end of what we think the impact of the conference might have been in energy terms, acknowledging the uncertainty. So we came out with an uncertainty that was, I'd have to look up the exact numbers because it's been a number of years, but it's like a factor of 8 almost, from the low estimate to the high estimate. But the fact that the low estimate was still a reasonable number made us feel good that we were having an impact. We just acknowledged that there was high uncertainty about what exactly it is, unless we were to actually go and measure energy consumption or maybe do something related to HERS ratings in buildings pre and post, or the attendees versus non-attendees in some way. So we felt pretty good about the comprehensiveness of this. We were limited. We had about $20,000 of in-staff time to do this. So all the ideas you threw out could be turned into a fairly expensive, rigorous evaluation. We did what we could internally to just get a metric and feel really good about it. We followed this up with post-conference surveys in subsequent years and got really, really low response rates to a quarter of the people that we were targeting, to where we didn't feel like we could use those results and that they'd be very reliable. So just then doing the post-conference surveys of what did you do differently using those insights to steer what the survey needs to look like didn't work too well because we just couldn't get people to react to us. It really does take somebody to be on the phone with them to get 10 minutes of their time. So that was our approach, but you threw out a number of really great ideas. Thank you for working through those issues together as a group. I hope you enjoyed it too, or at least it wasn't too painful.